Hey there, and welcome back to Lightroom Quickstart Bootcamp. We're continuing with Chapter 3 in the Develop module, and we're going to take a look at the right-hand panel in this video. Over there in the right-hand panels in Lightroom, we have a lot of items to talk about, so this is actually going to be split into two different videos. I will then do additional videos when we're going to be looking at all of the masking tools and everything else like that, so that portion I'm going to skip right now. That will come a little bit later. So let's start off here. I'm going to pick a different photo, and we're going to maybe go with that photo, and let's start off here with the histogram. Certainly we have the disclosure triangle, of course. We have these other areas. As I'm hovering over this, we can see those different areas highlighting. What does that represent? Well, let's take a look down right here where it says ISO. As I go up into the histogram, that's going to change. It says shadows, it says blacks, it says exposure, it says then highlights and whites. These items reference, you can also see down in the basic panel, as I move that, different items are highlighting down there. So this is another way to access your sliders, access your tools in the basic panel, and you can just go ahead and click, let's say, adjust them shadows, adjust that exposure, right there in the histogram. Now you can see the thing in the histogram is not actually, the cursor in the histogram is not actually moving all of that much, but that slider down below certainly is moving. And I should probably go ahead and go back to my history, and I'm going to do my future work now on a virtual copy so I don't mess anything up in my original image. Of course, I could do a snapshot like we learned in the last video, but let's just continue on here. All right, there are other pieces of information. When you are not on the image, so like when my cursor is over the image, you can see how it shows me the RGB value for that pixel that my cursor is over. And that can be kind of helpful just so you can understand how bright is this thing, right? What I find interesting, it shows you in percentages of values. It doesn't show you from 0 to 255. It shows you in percentages. I don't think I've ever seen RGB otherwise expressed anywhere else as a percentage. I have always seen it expressed as a value between 0 and 255. So for this to be percentage, okay, just let's make sure we know what we're looking at here. I just find that to be an interesting tidbit of information. When I move my cursor off of the image, then it changes and just shows me some basic details. So I've got the 100 ISO going on, the length of the lens, so the fact that it's 135 millimeters, f7.1, and then what I have a problem, especially when it's in fraction form, that little fraction, it's way over there because I have two monitors. It's way over there. It's really tiny. If I were to shift this over here to this monitor and I would have it more directly in front of me, that would probably be better. But I always work on my right-hand screen and do everything else here on my left-hand screen. And that's basically just the way it is. I don't know that I can have any other explanation for it. So if I need to know what that is, that's the only thing I have trouble with seeing sometimes because it's so far away. All right, this portion right here, where we've got the crop, the healing tool, the spot tool, all of these items, I'm going to actually cover in a future video. So there's a lot there from the masking, etc., red eye correction, etc. There's just a lot there. So we'll wait for that. For now, we're going to head on down to the basic panel, and we're going to take a look at what we're dealing with here. So here we go, the treatment. What are we going to do? Color, black and white. Pretty easy choice. If you go with color, you have certain profiles you can select from. So we can click on this. We have a few that are just immediately available, or we can hit the browse. Now we can also hit this button here, which will take us basically to that browser. It just gives us that whole idea of what we're looking at. But let's make sure we remember to hit that close button, because everything went away. And so if we come down here and we hit browse, we can see it does the exact same thing. So depending on which ones we want to look at, we have color or just the black and whites. So we could, filter it out from there. We've got some artistic items. Let's take a look at these. And again, as I just mouse over, it gives us a little preview in the image itself as to what the options are going to look like. Now this is going to be a little bit different than presets, because if I were to go ahead and select this one, let's go ahead and do that. We're going to select it, and then I have an amount. I mean, I can really cook it in, or I can just gently, just a little bit kind of a thing, put it in there. I'll go ahead and leave it at 100. I'm going to close this. But as you can see, all of my other settings here are the exact same as what I originally had them from my original processing. And these items over here, these are what's controlled by the presets that we were looking at in the previous video, where now the profile, that's just a different beast for how it's treating color from a base level understanding kind of a thing. It's just saying, hey, we're going to look at your raw data, of course, but we're going to apply this kind of processing to it that has, it's more of an under the ground processing, I guess you could say, because all of these items which you have exact control over, as you can see, we now have very different, I mean, this is what I had before with the Adobe Landscape, and now we have this. And of course I can go and choose pretty much whatever else is, brought in here. I can go to the modern, I can select whatever this one is. That actually looks kind of cool. I like that. Cook it in real much or pull it back a little bit. Again, I'll go ahead and keep to the 100. I'll hit close. And again, all of my presets are there. I've just changed how the nature of everything is coming together with, again, the idea of profiles and what's happening there. Almost feels like a monochrome image. That's interesting. And as we look down here in calibration, again, it didn't change anything there. It's just this kind of system that really digs under the hood and just changes things up for how you are going to apply a certain aesthetic to your image. Now, if I were to, let's go ahead and experiment here. This part I've never actually done. So I want to go ahead and go to my develop settings, and I'm going to hit reset. And as you can see, it takes it back all the way, even with the profile, but it took all these things away. So let's go ahead and get back into our profile selector. And I was in modern, and I had chosen, I think it was 5. So you can see what the modern 5 looks like without any of those settings. So this is your starting point of what the raw looks like with that particular there we go, with a little bit of back and forth on that. But that's what the file looks like with that particular preset selected. And then, of course, all of those changes I had just really modified it a whole lot. So if we were to go back all the way to here in the history, and then we can get back to where we were, it's a little more dramatic, kind of a nice look. I like what's going on there. So in this idea of whether it's presets, of course, presets, you can actually purchase preset packs and you can load them in, and that can, or get some free ones. That can be a really cool thing to get a style kind of going forward, get something where you can just browse through, get the creative juices flowing, and then maybe make your own tweaks. I would definitely suggest always be open to making your own tweaks in there. But the same idea can happen with the profiles. Maybe you can see an image in a new way by just browsing your profiles. I think there's some really cool things that can happen there. I like what I'm seeing, and it's just something that it's another tool in your tool set. I'm not saying this is the only way to do it or that you should even do it. I'm just making you aware of it and saying, yeah, it's another tool in the tool set. Let's at least contemplate it. All right, with this basic panel, we have so many options to choose from. So when we continue on down, we've got the white balance tool, and notice here we've got presets here for white balance, whether it's tungsten, shade, etc. This is going to set the color temperature and the tint, whatever you are setting it to, or if you were to use the white balance target tool, its point and purpose is to try and take whatever you've got and make that a neutral gray or neutral tone. So let's try that out here. It should be fairly easy on this image because there's virtually no color anyway. So let's pick this target area to be neutral. And you can see, because it was warm, it has now shifted everything. Everything else feels cool, but this particular spot right here, that's a neutral color. If I were to come over here, everything is cool here. It's going to warm everything up dramatically. So when you're clicking that nice, quick, and easy target, this is where I can say, look, scientifically, yes, this is supposed to be perfectly a neutral item, a neutral set of pixels right there that you made. But maybe aesthetically it doesn't feel right. Well, go right in there. I need to warm it up a little bit, maybe add in a little bit of pink. Aesthetically, that feels more pleasing maybe. Again, on this image, I'm not casting judgment. I'm just showing you how the tool works. But although I could cast judgment and say, yes, that's a little bit nicer. But it's the idea of saying, look, make it your own. If it's a very standard lighting scenario, then I would say, sure, go ahead and say, hey, look, it was a cloudy day. Give me some color temperature settings that would balance out a general idea of what it's like to be on a cloudy day. Now, given the fact that this was sunrise, any of these things, no, they'll get you in the right area probably, but you're going to probably be customizing it. Like I did with this one, you can see when I'm on this one, 6198 or something like that, plus 25 to really bring out some of those hopefully super rich colors coming in. But again, with this, I mean, there's something dramatic about that almost black and white feel. Really like what I'm seeing there, but I digress. Let's get back into it here. If you're curious about this notion of the temperature, what is that based off of, and why is it so stinking high? What we're looking at here is to say, look, we're going to take kind of a standard almost chemistry approach here. When you're in the lab and you're burning something, you're trying to understand what kind of material it is. Well, chemists know for a certain object to burn, it will burn at a certain temperature. And so then they say, hey, it's burning at this temperature. When something is burning at this temperature, it has this color of light coming off from the flame. So a tungsten light is going to be really yellow, and so it's going to give you that really warm tone. And the really hot stuff, or maybe something like middle of the day, it's going to be a really cool tone. And so you can see what's happening here with how it's balancing out. Now here's another question. Why does this blue, if I'm saying a really hot color is literally blue, then why does this have the opposite effect if I am balancing it out? Well, what this is doing is it's saying, look, it wants to give us the opposite color of what the light source is so that we can have that neutral color gray. You can see up in here where there are a lot of really warm hues in this image. Well, it requires this type of blue offset in order to make that a neutral gray. And this is saying, look, your light source itself, it is the 3500 roughly here, Kelvin temperature. And what we want to be able to do is say, okay, we need this much blue to offset that much color, that much, Kelvin temperature burning color. And okay, this will then, they'll offset and they'll give us a neutral gray. And then the opposite, of course, is true. When we have something that is just really, really blue. So for instance, if you were to take a colorimeter and you were going to point it at a standard, if you will, blue sky, you're going to get about 12,000 Kelvin is the measurement. Well, we need to balance that off. This is saying, look, we have a color temperature of 14,000 is what we're telling it. In order to get neutral gray, we would have to have this much yellow added into it in order for that light source that we have. And then what we're dealing with in post-production to balance that out to get our neutral color. And then your tint going one way or the other, it's kind of like, whatever you want to do. It's not going to be based on the same notion as temperature. It's just, we still have the same subtle push it one way, push it the other. And of course, this is all based on the standard RGB values. So our blue, the opposite of blue is yellow. The opposite of green is magenta. And we just don't have red represented there, but you can use them both in conjunction to be thinking about red as well. If red were your problem color, then you just do both of them in conjunction and you'll be able to control it. All right, moving on down. For our tone elements, we can hit the auto button if we think we like what Adobe is going to do for us there, but I don't think I have ever hit that button myself. Now, when I'm doing a pano stitch, it has an item that says auto settings. We'll see that in a future video. And I have done that a couple of times just to see what it'll do, but yeah, I've never hit this one myself. Exposure. So this is going to be the idea, it's in stops of exposure. And if you have an ISO invariant camera, or the sensor is ISO invariant, which means it doesn't really matter what your ISO is set to as it relates to what you do here. So let's say you were to photograph your scene, in this case 100 ISO. What if this were underexposed by 2 stops? Well, I could come in here and I could bump this up 2 stops. Certainly I'm not going to do that, but let's just hypothesize here for a moment. If you have an ISO invariant camera, then it doesn't matter if you bump it here or if you bumped it in your ISO in your camera. They will be the exact same result. So your Fuji cameras, a lot of your Sony cameras or Sony sensors are going to be considered ISO invariant. Most of your Canon sensors are not considered ISO invariant, but they're still extremely close. Nowadays, back in the day, 5-10 years ago, it was like, don't even think about it. You need some magic happening that Canon had put in there, but yeah, you don't even think about it. Otherwise, just think of it as levels of a stop. So if I were to do, 0.33, that's like one standard click on our adjustment. Whether we're adjusting the shutter speed, the ISO, or aperture, doesn't really matter. We're adding, let's say, a third of a stop of light. If I were to go negative 0.33, I am subtracting a third of a stop of light from whatever was the original exposure. It is certainly important to understand that part. So the contrast then, well, that's just a different beast. So let's go back down to 0. This is the idea of spreading apart the tonal values in the histogram. So take a look at the histogram there, and when I go from 0 to 100, we can see it slammed the items towards the left, and it slammed a few bit more items towards the right, and it flattened the middle. So it's wanting to push those items apart. I'm going to go ahead and adjust this exposure so I can have it be a little bit brighter. And let's go back to 0, and we can see what happens to the histogram again. It spikes more in the middle. And then there it is, spiking a little bit more out to the side. It's pushing it. And if I make that a negative, it will bring it really to the middle. And you can see what happens to the image there too. So that was originally a 66 or so. Doesn't matter. This is a virtual copy, so it doesn't really matter what I make the changes to. And then our highlights. We noticed when I first started talking the histogram, this is the region up here that the highlights focuses its attention on. It doesn't gate it off. And just like this one with exposure, it focuses its attention in that area. It will certainly push things and pull things from the other regions in that histogram, but that's where it focuses its attention. And then with the highlights, so we're taking a look and saying, hey, we're going to bump up those highlights, not the super bright ones, but we're going to bump them up or we're going to pull them down. What I often like to do in a shot like this, obviously you can see I didn't do it in this one, but I will pull down the highlights and I will pull up the whites. And what that does is that basically does that spreading of the histogram in the highlights region. So it keeps the whites whites and it pulls some of those highlights down, and I have greater contrast then. You have to be really careful. Make sure that you get those settings just right so you have the detail coming through exactly where you want it, but that's what I like to see coming through in those settings. Oftentimes in a shot like this with bright puffy things, or maybe the waterfall or something like that, anything with lots of lots of detail in those bright highlight areas, I'm really paying attention to where that histogram falls when I'm shooting the image, and then when I get it here in Lightroom, I'm able to make those subtle adjustments. I want to make sure that histogram doesn't slam all the way up against the right, because then I wouldn't have any room for my white slider to do its job. And my point there is to force it to pull this part away and pull that part that way, and then I have increased contrast, which gives me increased detail in those highlight regions. All right, our shadows and our blacks are the exact same idea, where we're taking we're looking at the dark areas and then the really dark areas of the image. In general, I don't find myself doing the exact same technique like I just talked about with highlights and whites, but you could do that if you needed to. What I usually end up doing is I will mess with shadows if I have to. I don't usually have to, but sometimes you do. And then with the blacks slider, my MO on that, let's go ahead and set that to 0, and we'll see what the reasoning is here. My MO on that is to, up here in the histogram, I didn't talk about this just yet. I'm going to talk about it now. These little indicators up here, these are brilliant little indicators. Let's take a look at what happens when I slide this item all the way back. I'm going to come down, and as I slide it down, oh, all of a sudden I got a white indicator here. That tells me that all channels now have an area that are just solid, well, in this case, nothing, no color at all. Since we're in the RGB color space, we just have 0 color at all. It's pure black. Nothing else is there, 0 detail. Now, okay, I see it changed to yellow. So that means that our green and our red is solid black, but our blue channel actually, there's nowhere in there that has just a 0 code for that color. There's at least a luminance value of 1 coming through. I should do that instead of 0. So for the blue channel, there's at least a luminance value of 1 for every pixel, if not higher, of course, because in these brighter areas, obviously it's higher. As I continue down, then it turns white, and now we can see, yep, that is solid black. Now, when I mouse over this, take a look at what happens in the very far left corner, down in the left-hand corner at the bottom there. I mouse over it, I get that blue highlight. I'm going to go ahead and click on this little thing now. It says Show Shadow Clipping. And so when I do that, and I'm going to wig out the black setting now, and just bring that all in, that is giving me a nice little indicator that says, hey, this region here, I'm just going to highlight it and make it sick looking for you so you can see it, Brent. This is where all of those items, all of those channels are just solid black with 0 detail. So this is not something that I would want to set for my image. Originally, it was in the neighborhood of -45 or so. So let's try that, -45-ish. Even for this, now again, I've changed the settings up some. If I were to come over here and take a look at that, you can see the -45 only has a little bit in my original setting. Because I changed the profile and so many other things, things have changed. So I would not set it to be that dark. I would set it to be about like this or so, something like that. What I like to do, the reason for this, I like to have something that's a nice, solid visual foundation for my image if it requires it. Not all images require it for sure, but something that gives you a nice little visual foundation that says, here is my solid, deep, dark colors, and everything else just illuminates from there. I like that. I like having that in my pictures, again, when it's called for. And this image, I would suggest, is definitely called for. I do try and go for just a minimum amount. So, you know, even if I had just that much, I would be satisfied with it. If I had that much, I would think it's a little too much probably. But anywhere between there and there on this particular image, I'm going to say that's enough. Now for the highlights, we do the same thing. So let's go ahead and click this item up here. So it'll just turn on, you know, it'll highlight for us. But as we can see, and I slide up the whites slider, it comes in as red. And so these items, it's suggesting, hey, these are blown out. These are pure white. But let's take a note here again. Here we're looking at the triangle. The triangle is actually only yellow. When you bring green and red together, you get yellow. So that tells us that those two channels are the ones clipping out. Blue has yet to clip out. So let's slide this back and maybe we'll get just red, or maybe we'll get just green showing up there. Or maybe they're so close together. See, they are so close together. Let's go ahead and we're going to slide our magenta way high. And I think I'll slide the yellow way high, because magenta and yellow make red. So hopefully what I can do now when I slide my white slider, there it is. See, I have just the red channel. This is the only channel where at somewhere, that's the only one that's pure, just full on 255 luminance values. And there you have your pure white color starting to come through anyway. Not completely, because in that spot, notice that little teeny spot there, we still have the blue that's not full 255 luminance values and the green that's still not 255 luminance values. It's just giving us a heads up saying, hey, you got at least one channel that is going crazy here. Now look what happened here. Because of all those color changes I made, this is now a cyan tone up here on the darks, on the blacks side, the shadow clipping. So the cyan is made when you combine blue and green together, and so we can see that red is not clipping out in the darks. All right, let's go back in our history to set this back to something that's a little closer to normal maybe. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off our highlight warnings. And we'll finish the video up with this presence item here. What's going on here with the presence? So texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. Let's walk through these super quick, and then we're going to take a look at exactly what they do. Texture is all about the idea of enhancing some edge detail. Clarity is the most probably nebulous. Well, actually, dehaze is probably the most nebulous, but the least used as far as what I generally do. But clarity is going to, its goal is to increase contrast in the midtones regions. But yeah, it behaves a little bit differently. Dehaze, certainly, well, exactly what it tries to do. It tries to say, hey, let's bring clarity, sorry, using the wrong term there probably, but let's cut through the fog, as it were. Or maybe we can do a negative number and create some fog. And then vibrance, it will try and enhance the saturation in colors that are already not very saturated. So if you have an image, kind of like maybe this one, where some colors are already saturated, that's why I use vibrance on this image, because I had some that weren't very saturated. And I was like, let's bring you up. We want to see you. Please come forward. And so the vibrance will do that while generally trying to leave skin tones alone. That's usually the case. And then with the saturation, certainly that's just overall saturation. Let's just punch you up and get you going, or pull you back. If you pull it back all the way to negative 100, you're going to get a black and white image. It's not necessarily the same as hitting black and white up here. We'll probably have to cover that in a different video, hitting black and white and what goes on there. But it is still, as you can see, it's a black and white image, right? All right, let's take it back up to where it was. And now let's talk details, at least about these two items, texture and clarity. Now for texture, it's really a good idea to be zoomed in at 100%. Now, zoom in at 100% somewhere that makes sense, because in the sky like that, yeah, hopefully there's nothing there that's going to be going crazy with it. All right, so this is a good place for texture. And I'm going to go ahead and take off clarity so we can see them behaving separately. And we want to be zoomed in at 100% because it's all about the fine, minute details around edges. And so it's going to look for those edges and to try and enhance those edges. And it doesn't matter where those edges appear in the image. So I'm going to go ahead and wig it out all the way. And you can see it's really making it crunchy, really bringing those edges up to the forefront. If I were to go negative, it really does boy, you know, whatever that is, makes it feel like soup or something like that, a soupy day. In this particular shot, we're probably not going to see too much difference between texture and clarity, but let's go ahead and maybe get ourselves into 200%, and we'll probably be able to see a difference there. So we have, let's do this. So there and there, we can see it's just really making those edges more present, right? Well, clarity, it didn't necessarily make those edges more present. And so that's a distinct difference. It did, I think, bring us some greater difference here along the ridge line and along this major ridge line. So let's make this back to 0 again. And then go back up here with texture again and see it happens on every single one of those items. So it's just a difference in how it applies itself and what it does. They do work differently, but they're both AI driven, at least to a degree. And they are different for each photo. Texture I have found to be more consistent from photo to photo, but clarity is definitely a photo by photo basis. Now let's take a look also here at clarity zoomed out. I like to look at clarity a little bit zoomed out because it will definitely affect things up here in the clouds. So let's take a look at clarity here on that and look at how the clouds are different, right? And then I take clarity off, and then let's do texture, and the clouds will be hardly touched at all, if at all. A little bit, but not as much as with clarity. As you can see with clarity, even up here in this portion of the clouds, up the left-hand corner, we got some change. If you're looking right here at the bright spot of the clouds, yes, we did certainly have similar effects happening with texture, but just in a much more tight fashion, not as broadly applied. And then dehaze, it goes so drastic. For me, I rarely use it. But when you need it, and it can do great. A couple years ago, I did an image, and it was exact same subject, 2 different frames, the same setting, and it just had completely different color applied from one frame to the next. And I was like, no, I'll never use it. But Adobe has improved it for sure. And I say, yes, if you need your dehaze, by all means, don't be afraid to use it. Just experiment and make sure that it's working right for you and it's getting you the results that you need in your image. All right, that was a whirlwind of items here. The first video on the right-hand panels where we took a look at the histogram. We started there. We then jumped down to just the basic panel. We're going to finish up in the next video with everything else underneath it. So stay tuned for that. I look forward to seeing you there. Until then, happy shooting.